So I think I'll leave it at that. I'm going on a little long. Do we take questions?
Yeah, you can take questions.
Okay, great.
I'm sorry, I missed myth number 2. Would you mind going over that one again?
Yeah, I have to remember what it was. I
The
don't
first
have it.
one,
It reaches every corner of the world.
Okay. Oh, yes. Yes, the idea that nowhere is safe. But in fact, lots of places are relatively safe. I think the stat I find that 10% of the countries of the world account for 75% of all terrorism in the database. And it's even true at the local level. Even if you take like the 5 boroughs of New York, almost all of the action is in Manhattan. So at every level, it's concentrated. So that's the, yeah, please.
I have 2 questions. One was, I wonder how your model deals with kind of paramilitary actors who have some connection.
Yeah, that's the other. I don't remember if the gentleman who mentioned, this gentleman mentioned military. The other big problem is paramilitary. We try to exclude them. What gets tricky though, and this is a big problem in Latin America where you have groups that if we know they're connected to the government, we exclude them. We also, we have a board of experts that that sort of oversee the database. And one of the adaptations we made about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, is we've added flags to the database. So some people will argue any military target is not terrorism. So if you want to strip those cases out, you can do that. Some would argue any attack on police is not terrorism. I think that's less common, but some people would argue that. You can strip those cases out. So you can rack the data to fit your own definitions. We realized when we began this, because there is no universal definition of terrorism, we're going to spend all of our time defining it. So what we require is people to be explicit on their definition, but they can use the data as they think most appropriate. So yeah, that's the other. That's not as bad. The military is the one that gives us the biggest fits, but paramilitary groups are also challenging. I'm not sure. Sure, go ahead.
Are you also excluding cyber terrorism?
We don't have, I think, a single case of cyber. Who would you give as a cyber terrorist? Anything?
How would you know any?
I always get that question, and I don't think we have a single worldwide case yet.
Let me follow that.
Sure.
Because, I was just thinking of lulsec or anonymous, but what that requires, and I think with regard to moving forward, is to, at least with the database and the project and trying to deal with this, is it's going to take a redefinition of a political target perhaps, because if you say, well, there's a way to say that you could attack a water system, like dam system, for example, which has not happened yet. So what's going to happen is it's going to emerge, right?
Right.
So you need to redefine terrorism in some sense, because it's going to include a broader set of events, and also what a weapon is, because a computer can be used as a weapon.
Right.
Right.
True.
So yeah. So and I mean, this is too large for, because I was thinking the same thing. This is too large to take on. Right?
Yeah.
Right. What we've been doing with, and there have been a number of these things that have come up, like the military one actually. So we've actually had a separate project that's studying insurgencies. And so the idea is we keep our attempt to keep terrorism separate and then compare it to the insurgency database. We've had another one we've had from the beginning of the database in 1970, we were talking about this before the talk began, but we have this kinetic requirement that requires an actual action. So we're not tracking plots, or we're not tracking hoaxes. So in other words, you get people that are building a suicide vest. If they blow themselves up, we don't include it. If they put the suicide vest and walk out the door, we do include it. And you get a lot of those foiled, failed plots, increasingly, I think, in some ways. So we actually started a separate project. We left this database alone, but we have a separate one that tries to track foiled and failed plots. The idea, I think, though, if we're going to try to build a science around this, that we want to be explicit on what the rules are, put the rules out there. And actually, one of the interesting things about doing this database gets downloaded now. I mean, we're getting something like 1.5 million web hits a month now on this stuff. So we'll get somebody from Pakistan saying, you got this case wrong, here's the news source to go with it. So if you find something wrong, we will change it, but we have to have a source. But nobody predicted the impact of computers on society, and yet they're huge historically. That's the whole notion of a black swan. When when the Europeans discovered there was a black swan, it suddenly said, oh my God, we had it all wrong all this time, and nobody predicted it. So I think it is very difficult to predict. We're not very good at it. We're better at explaining it once it's happened. Now, the first question about who's included, who's excluded, if I understand where you're heading with that, I'd say we have tried to go fearlessly wherever the data take us. And a lot of times it takes us where we are very comfortable. Like we were talking about before the talk began, we have a bunch of South African ANC cases in the database because political violence, non-state actors, political. Even though there might be a lot of support and sympathy for the motives of the group. But again, the argument is we try to put them in no matter what. We also had, we have some abortion bombings in the data, and you know, some people in government said, well, this isn't terrorism, but we had political violence. You know, it fit the definition. So we have tried to apply that definition as best we can.
Brief follow-up.
Sure.
Why do you exclude, or why do you include only non-state actors?
Basically, the database that we inherited from Pinkerton was looking at that. I mean, we actually, one of our colleagues on a different project has done a nice piece, Rick McCauley has done a nice piece saying a lot more people in the world have been killed by state terrorists than by non-state terrorists.
Exactly.
Don't disagree, but I got my hands full with what I've got. But it's not, I mean, I happen to get into this particular area, and but it's not to denigrate how important the state has been. Thanks for the questions. Yeah, please.
I have two questions. One, terrorism is a strategic interaction between two actors to a large extent. And I wondered, to what extent does the phenomenon of burstiness has anything to do with how well counterterrorism actions by states are able to be effective? If they respond fast enough, if they are able to, you know, kind of destroy those terrorist organizations?
I think that's, you know, a great policy question. I mean, like if you remember the example from hijackings,
Right.
once we get the explosive growth, we tried a bunch of things. Many of them didn't work, but metal detectors, I think, did work.
Right.
Suicide bombings, I think there have been some things that have been somewhat effective. Improvised explosive devices, I think, got more effective over time. I think that's exactly right. What's interesting, I think, is that you tend to find this bursty quality in places like Baghdad, even when the military was obviously very concerned about this problem. And you'd think they'd be, you know, out there targeting repeat places like that. And you still tend to get a bursty characteristic like that. But to me, that's actually that's the big counterterrorism question. And it suggests that, you know, again, you can't be sort of sitting around. You better take it seriously, or a lot of people are going to get killed. So,
Right. Can I,
Sure.
another follow-up? The black swan quality of 9/11, I'm not sure exactly what makes it a black swan. I mean, the magnitude?
not just what Talib is saying is actually more radical than that. He's actually arguing it's kind of it's what you might call a fat tail distribution. That we end up, most of our statistics are based on this normal distribution. And if you had a normal distribution showing fatalities, the mean would be something like, you know, a little over 1 or maybe 2, somewhere in there. And then you've got 3,000 involved in the World Trade Center. So it's essentially saying that our metrics for doing this are not very good. We're lousy at predicting these sorts of things. After the fact, we come back and we say, oh yeah, this was perfectly predictable. It was due to, you know, economics or political situations, etc. But in terms of predicting it beforehand, we're not very good, even though it's really these things that have such an impact. In some ways, there's a parallel in criminology, in the United States in particular. If there's a nasty crime, you know, some 5-year-old is murdered on the way to school, you can bet at the next legislative session you're going to have 50 bills on, you know, to prevent that from happening, even though it's a totally atypical case. So that's really the kind of characteristic I think he's getting at there. Yes, please.
Just briefly, you said that you're receiving about 1.5 million hits a month on
Yeah.
GTR. How does it make you at all nervous that any of this could actually be used to help terrorists?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Homeland Security asked that question a lot. I think most of the work we're doing is so general that I'm not too worried about it. In fact, it's interesting. When we first got funded by Homeland Security, they wanted us to track, you know, who was, you know, downloading the data. We refuse to do that. We get them from all over the world, though. But it's a great question. We do have some of the projects we're working on, like we have details on infrastructure that we don't put on the web, even though it's unclassified stuff. I can't say, obviously. I don't know of any known incidents where a terrorist group, has used our data to make a decision. I find it interesting and it's interesting, burglars, most criminals are relatively dumb in a sense. They don't respond that well to police changes, but, terrorists arguably are more likely to be paying attention. It's definitely something that's come up a lot in the last 10 years. So far, we've left it open. I think a lot of the way, I think government has really found it, we ship this stuff to something like, I think we counted 1,800 government bureaus, agencies, and departments now. And I think the reason they like it is they've got their own classified stuff. But you can imagine when the Boston Marathon case happened, the police department suddenly has all of this media problem. Well, they can download our data. We know, how many bombings of marathons have happened, where they've happened, how many have been in Boston, how many pressure cooker bombs, how many Chechen attacks. So they don't have to, they couldn't probably gather all that stuff without open source stuff from a group like ours. So it saves them to actually, I think, get into the real investigative stuff. Good question, though. Yes, please.
Okay,
Yeah, please.
Speaking of, I wanted you to put on specifically your criminologist hat. And I was really interested in the near repeat phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Yes.
Human-
So I
yeah.
understand the modeling and why that's important,
Yes.
but if you're looking at how to sort of use that near repeat phenomenon
Mm-hmm.
and see how it works with terrorism, what's causality?
Well, yeah, I don't know if somebody who saw this. The colleague I'm working on is from Los Angeles. Did you see this thing in the press about minority? The movie Minority Report, where you get arrested. We get so good at predicting who's going to commit crime that we arrest you before you've done it. And this near repeat stuff was driving this, because police departments are using this stuff now to make this kind of prediction. It's probably as close as we'll ever get to real prediction. I think at least it's human nature that we like to go to familiar areas. We go where we're comfortable. So if we had success in a particular area, we go back to it, basically. What I find remarkable about it is it seems to be so widespread that the same logic applies to burglaries, gang shootings. You look at the maps, you can go, extremely different behavior and see the same kind of pattern coming into it. Now, as this gentleman's saying, once we publish all this stuff saying this happens, do people change their patterns? Now, in criminology, we were really concerned about, if you do, you've got a burglary hotspot. If you put a lot of law enforcement in that area, do they just move over? The answer seems to be no, that we don't see that much displacement. But whether that's true for terrorism, which is presumably a more kind of rationally planned in advance, I don't know the answer to that.
A quick follow here. What does the arrest plot look like? So do you end up arresting a lot of burglars?
Well, increasingly, that's the whole. Basically, if you look at American policing, as recently, still to some extent today, the main policing strategy in America was random preventive patrol. You basically put a couple people, one or two people in a police car, you randomly drive around and hope you'll stop a crime. And now, certainly big police departments have gone much more to hotspots policing because certain areas are hotspots for certain kinds of crime, and so putting your resources there are much more likely to have an impact. So probably that affects the sort of steepness of the trail off now. And there's beginning to be some work on that, where you can actually distinguish, is the trail off happening because people are just moving on to other neighborhoods, or is it due to law enforcement? Certainly happened, I think, in Iraq with improvised explosive devices as the military got better at responding. Yes, please.
You've given us a lot of really fascinating data and a lot of diverse perspectives on how to look at it. I'm interested in the public policy implications of it. If I could, maybe you won't agree, but if I could frame the most recent debate after Snowden's revelations of the extent of government surveillance, the response of NSA and also in Congress was, well, it's prevented a lot of terrorist activity, and therefore it's worthwhile. Now, the terrorist activity that's prevented is not actually in your database, as I understand it.
Right.
So what's the...
Well, not quite right. We have a flag in there, unsuccessful essentially. So we get unsuccessful attacks, but there has to be some kinetic action. And you're quite right. The FBI completely changed its policy on terrorism after 9/11. It used to be reactive. It became much more proactive. So the number of foiled and failed plots went up dramatically. We actually sponsored a project on that topic. A guy from West Point called Eric Dahl did it. And he doesn't really support very well the argument against the Snowden stuff. I mean, you get this idea from government that we'll get all of these data and then we'll connect the dots. What he showed most strongly is most of the foiled and failed plots were not sort of connecting the dots. They were much more like old-fashioned police work. Informants, work in neighborhoods, people coming forward with information. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I think it's probably rarer than some of the people critiquing Snowden would argue. That's my own personal, please.
After foiled plots, is it still bursting in the same area? Do they try again in the same area, or does it tend to drag out?
And foiled as opposed to other kinds of attacks.
As opposed to a successful attack that's, that is still bursting.
The success thing, yeah.
But
The answer is it does cut down. Like failed attacks,
Yeah,
unsuccessful
They
attacks,
tend to back off in that area.
yeah, measurably back off. I mean, we have a pretty good study on the IRA on that exact, and unsuccessful attacks are a predictor of fewer future attacks in a particular part of the city or a particular region. Yes. Which is kind of, I mean, fairly rational thinking in a way. Yeah. Good question. Yeah,
Do
please.
you do any advocacy?
How do you mean?
Any policy recommendations? Any kind of?
Oh, yeah, we do. We brief congressional committees. We present a lot, yes. I don't know if anybody listens, but, we
But you
put out-
present your data with a policy implication?
Yeah. Well, like, for example, we did a briefing, and a couple of charts, this domestic international thing, I was really pretty surprised by those findings. And if you think about it, one of the implications of that is if you really have an aggressive counterterrorism program, let's say in Pakistan, the main people that are going to be saved are Pakistanis. Because for the most part, the vast majority of attacks are involving Pakistan targets, which I think a lot of people don't really fully appreciate. So we try to be translational. DHS is not paying for us to write academic reports. They expect us to get the stuff out to the community. And so, yeah, we certainly try to do that.
Well, I think it remains to thank you very much
Yeah,
for
pleasure.
It was an incredibly insightful lecture, Dr. LaFree. So we at the IDS department would like to present you a couple gifts here. So firstly, we'd like to present you an IDS t-shirt.
It looks like it's the right size.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you so much. I'll wear with pride.
And we have one more for you. We have the poster with your talk on it. So
Oh, fantastic.
I'll stick it in your hand, please.
Yeah. Oh, we gotta show them? Want to show everybody?
Show everybody.
Wait, okay,
Yep.
that would be,
Wow, cool. Yeah, high quality too, look at that. Gee, how about that? I'll have to put that in our start office.
That's
Wow,
there we
that's
go.
very cool. Oh, thank you so much. That's very cool. Wow, that's very nice. Well,
Good luck pulling it back
So-
up now.
Well, seriously, you guys should go to this
Oh,
website.
yes. Oh, I forgot to say.
Yeah.
Also, if you're interested in being on our listserv, if you just pop this into your iPhone or your camera, you'll get our newsletter. And of course, you can unsubscribe if you want to get rid of the newsletter. But it'll have, though, quite a bit of reports and events and things about this episode.
Yeah, and also the website has, since it is open source, that's actually an extremely literal term for that website.
It is.
Because
since I've worked with it, I think you guys should definitely visit it. You can look at it by country, by year, by weapons used, targets, anything. So all you can think of, you can find on that website. And we ran kind of over, but there's a lot of food in the next room, so if anyone wants to interact and continue the conversation, we can do that in the next room. Thank you for coming.